Hello everyone, I'm Tanya Srivastava from the Jindal Forum of Space Law. We are space law enthusiasts who wish to encourage discourse on space law. My co-host today is Ritvika.
Hello everyone, I'm Ritvika Bogula. I'm a second year law school from Jindal Global University. And we have Professor Milanov with us, who is an associate professor and teaches space law in Jindal Global School from past 5 years. And he has his master's from Sofia University in 2008. He has published numerous articles, scientific reports to the government of Bulgaria, and also published two books. And we're extremely happy to host you today in the podcast, Professor.
Hello, thank you for having me, Rivika and Tanya, and hello to everybody who is watching this podcast.
All right, Professor. So today we want to discuss the very basics of space law, and we want for our viewers who don't know as much about space law to understand where it comes from. My first question to you would pertain to what space law is, and is if there is a need to have such laws. Additionally, if there is a need to have such laws, are there any treaties that exist right now to govern this domain?
Sure. Okay, so you're asking several questions here. I will start from the first one. So space law, if we want to be precise when we're using this term, space law can be national and international. From your second and third question, I see that you are asking me a little bit more on the international space law. Yes, this part. So when we're talking about the international space law, the scholars and the governments agreed basically in the early 60s that there is a huge need for this new branch of public international law. And they developed the whole idea of it as separately than air law, for example. And basically, international space law is a public international law branch that governs the relationship between states and intergovernmental organizations, which, as you both know, are the main subjects in public international law. And those relationships have to be somehow related with outer space activities. So basically space exploration or utilization or exploitation of outer space resources. So this is the simple definition of international space law. Now, national space law is created by the governments, obviously, and this is the legislation, principles, different acts of the governments that regulate their national legislation. Most of the time it is complying with the international space law principles and the treaties that you were asking about, and both exist simultaneously. Your third question, I will take from here. Okay, you will ask me three questions at the same time. So the third question is, how did you frame it? Are there treaties that are regulating international space law? Yes, all right. As you know that, and many of the viewers know, that international law in general, public international law, one of the main sources is the international treaty, right? And the other one, main one, is international legal custom. So we have, and the principles and judicial decisions as additional sources, but the treaty is the main source, especially for those relatively new branches of public international law. So when we talk about international treaties, there are many of them, but the core of international space law is adopted by a specific committee that was established in the UN, the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. And in this committee, basically, the states agreed to adopt 5 treaties. And the first 4 of them actually are representing the backbone of the international space law.
Thank you so much. I also wanted to ask you a follow-up to my questions. Is that when it comes to, for example, aviation or air law, there is basically a branch that discusses sovereignty and those kinds of issues. And then there is the more private aspect to it when it comes to leasing of aircraft. So is there such a similar when it comes to, space law, like, for example, leasing of satellites or leasing of, I don't know, just just machines that would go to space. So, like, would that also be covered by international space law, or because it's private, it's something else?
Now, when we talk about the core of international space law, in the treaties itself, in those main treaties that I spoke about, let's tell which are they. The Outer Space Treaty, most important maybe treaty of all. The Rescue Agreement, the Registration Convention, and the Liability Convention. The fifth one is the Moon Treaty that was initially agreed by the states, but later, for reasons that are not very known or publicly discussed, the treaty remained unratified by most of the nations, with a few exceptions. And those states that ratified the Moon Agreement, the Moon Treaty, are not actually leading spacefaring nations, with the exception of Australia. Now, leasing of satellites is a possibility, but this is basically, it goes through either bilateral agreements between states, or it has to go through the involvement of space industry, private space industry, and or if it is an internal act between two private companies that are from the same nationality, it goes in a national space law. It's framed. It is possible, and it has been done.
All right, thank you, Professor. Ritvika, if you have any questions, like.
So, Professor, since I'm only in my second year of law school, and space law is such a unique space, unique career option to go through. I would like to know what exactly had motivated you to study and understand space law, and in this process of studying space law, what challenges have you faced? I would really love to know about your challenges.
Okay, so since you were a second-year law student, then my advice to you and everybody who is in their first or second year, you need to focus your attention on studying really well, public international law. If you study well public international law, and we have wonderful professors here in Jindal, wonderful colleagues that will give you excellent possibility to do that, opportunity to do that, then it will be much easier for you to understand international space law when you join my class or the class of my colleague Pasana Gupta, or at some point if you're joining the class of my other colleague Professor Biswanath Gupta. So both Professor Pasana and Professor Biswanath are involved in international space law, so we're quite a team here, quite a group of space lawyers in Jindal. All right, so you asked me personally. For me, space law was not I was not interested in it during my student years. Actually, I was not really well acquainted with it. We didn't have an elective on it in Sofia. Later, I saw that a colleague of mine offered an elective. So I was interested in international law in general, public international. And after graduation, I was working on several projects, we call it European projects. And after that, there was a specific day. I don't remember the exact date, but I remember what happened that day. I saw an interview of the famous journalist. Now he has passed, Larry King. I'm sure that you know about him, and you've seen some of his old podcasts or interviews. So at that time, he was an anchor, a leading journalist in CNN. And he had very unusual guests, 3 guests that were people that were involved in the US military. I think all 3 of them were former military personnel, but they were senior personnel, or at least middle level. And what they were discussing at that time, and he asked them very good questions, what they were discussing was the 3 separate occasions of UFO activity in the United States military bases. And this activity was recorded it was they have seen it, some of them personally, they have witnessed it. And one of the things that struck me was that at that time, I forgot the name of the captain. I think I think it is Robert Salas. I will check and verify this. And he confirmed that at least 10 rockets with nuclear warheads have been have malfunctioned because of this activity. And he said this is very unusual. And this cannot happen with, it could happen maybe with one rocket. It is very strange to happen with two, but if it happens with all 10 of them, it means that something is doing something on this base here. And so he was very troubled by this. And immediately, as a person who is asking, as a young person like you who is asking questions at that time, I am chewing this news, this completely new information for me in the following way. What does it mean for international relations and international law if the major state, like the United States, cannot use their nuclear weapons? If there is a force that is stronger than them and is showing them in a matter of minutes that they can pretty much block their nuclear potential. So if it happens to them, obviously it could happen to any other state. And this X factor in international relations, international law, basically sparked my interest and created this sort of feeling that I need to understand more about this particular issue. And then I started my journey, and this journey continued for 3 years as a research fellow in the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, and I was I was working on international space law issues.
Professor, such a good information we got today.
Yes.
And are there any challenges you face like in this process? Like,
yes, we have, how to say, unique Balkan type of challenges, which can happen with any student or any research fellow. So I had a lot of challenges, but I don't want to go there. These are not nice moments. But the challenges, like academic challenges that you could face, or at least I faced at that time, was that it was not really popular, this branch of international law was not very popular. We didn't have much literature in Bulgarian or in English. So I need to go in Hack Academy or in Vienna University. Online resources were not that well available as they are right now. So this was my academic challenges that I saw, but the authors that I wrote are still probably everything that they have analyzed and they have shared in the 80s, in the 90s, 2000, it is still valid. So even if you're reading international space law manual or book that was written in the 1980s, late 1980s, it will still be very useful for a space law student today. 90% of it, it's still there. What has changed is not so much in the last 20 years or 30 years.
All right, Professor, thank you so much for letting us know. Because we discussed UFOs and we are going on that tangent, I would also want to ask you about meta law and what your opinion on it is. And also, do you think that international organizations are ready to have that conversation yet,
All right. So at that time, I knew, I didn't know much about meta law. So let me clarify this for your audience here, for the students of JGU and other people that are watching or listening to this podcast. So meta law is a term that was, I don't know whether it's the best term, but this is the term that we're using today. It was framed or coined by a lawyer, American lawyer. His name is Andrew Haley. And in the late 50s, early 60s of the 90s. And basically, he hypothesized what should the legislation be and what should the relationship be between states and humanity with unintelligent beings that might exist or at some point could see in the universe, so extraterrestrial civilizations, as he refers to them, and as we all know, we know this term from also from movies, etc., and other articles. Search for extraterrestrial intelligence is another way to frame this, I would say, this movement. So meta law is something that at this point it can be seen in two ways. So the first way, or the first angle from which it could be perceived, is to think about how to establish relationships with extraterrestrial civilizations that might exist in the future. So basically to prepare ourselves. But what I have told you 5 minutes ago about this interview with Larry King and about a lot of whistleblowers, data and public documents that have been released, declassified, there is a strong possibility that extraterrestrial intelligent beings have already made contact with some human beings here on Earth and also with state representatives. Or this is at least, these are the testimony and the information that is provided by high-level officials. There are so many that hundreds of them, including Minister of Defense, including former President of Russia, etc., etc., etc. So many politicians and people in the military, or also in the intelligence community, discuss this issue and carefully discuss it, and they are, for some reason, for their own agenda, their own reasons, they're trying to inform the general public about it. Now, I was also an advocate to do that, and I was talking in the UN forums about this issue. From everything that I have studied and the information that I had at that time, and how to make it much more available to the general public and to share it between governments. To your second question, whether the organizations, governments or international organizations are ready to discuss this, as you asked me, they are ready to discuss it, but not publicly. All right? So there is a big difference who are you talking to. Like right now we're having a public discussion, broadcasting. So we're having a different type of influence to the, or effect to the general public. Now, I am aware of discussions that, for example, even, by the way, even the churches, like Catholic Church, they became interested in this issue in the last decade, all right, or at least show their interest publicly. Before that, they dismissed it. Now, after 2009, 2010, 2011, so this 10, 15 years ago, even the Catholic Church started organizing seminars and different discussion forums with representatives from different, from academia, from international organizations, etc., to share information and to prepare some sort of common views on the approach to extraterrestrial life, right? Because, and the attitude that different organizations or different states as well should have. So discussions are taking place, but behind very thick doors, okay? Let's put it this way. Obviously, this is a very sensitive topic. In my view, this topic needs to be presented in an academic way. It needs to be researched properly. It needs to engage much more with citizens, because they have the right to know what is happening on Earth if contact has been established, if there is some sort of foreign influence on our governments, and I think every citizen in a democratic society especially is entitled to know, right? So yes.
Thank you so much, Professor, for answering our questions. We also agree with you as when it comes to whatever I have studied, that there needs to be a formal conversation about such subjects. Because even if we were to rely on the assumption that there has been no contact, that there is no such thing yet, I feel that as a contingency, we should have some kind of a system that helps us, maintain that kind of a relationship with extraterrestrial beings if that ever happens, even if it hasn't happened. But yes, so I knowing this was nice. We had discussed in the very beginning about international laws and national laws, how there is a difference of sorts. So, on that note, I'd like to ask you, how are, first of all, these treaties executed in countries? Because I understand that, you also spoke about the Moon Agreement and how some countries have not exactly ratified it, or, so when it comes to these treaties, when it comes to ratifications, how do you ensure that it's being, implemented in its full, yeah.
How it happens, basically the implementation, as it is called in international law, it happens as in every other branch. So basically, the states participate in the negotiation of these treaties, which means that every issue that is covered in them, it has to be accepted by the states. Now, because the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space involved in the beginning, not every state, involved those states that were basically have some capacity of to have their own space industry. They were spacefaring nations, and to some extent, it was designed to have balanced participation between Americans, the Western type of thinking, and at that time, this is the late 50s, early 60s, also communist countries and countries that are in the so-called Soviet orbit of influence, political influence. Now, so when it comes to implementation these days, the treaties are accepted, the principles have been established, so the national legislation, whether it is a space act of some sort of, normally it's a national space legislation, that is, if there is a parliament, the parliament adopts the legislation. It somehow mentions the principles that are established in international space law. This is very important because if the states do not have the same view about how outer space should be utilized, where the boundary between airspace and outer space lies, all of these issues, it will be very difficult for them to exist in this environment and having their own space industry. And they need, basically, they need to adopt those rules together. Now, today we're seeing one of the biggest problems that we are seeing today in international space law is that most of the states, especially those that are leading states, especially the United States of America, they are having a little bit of trouble even complying with the principles that they agreed in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Why? Because today there is a huge potential for their private sector, a couple of companies, as most of you already know them, to profit extremely well from the outer space resources, from asteroids, from the moon, from at some point Mars, etc. So all of these concrete material resources that I'm referring to otherwise have to be shared somehow between everybody, let's say, or if we are applying the common heritage of mankind principles, if we agree that outer space is res communis. But even today, the American administration, starting from always, basically, they didn't discuss this issue. And when Trump became president, he denounced this with an executive order, as you, Tanya, know, and my other students, we have discussed this in my classes. And what is worse is that the Biden administration continues to accept this policy. Why? Because they want to allow their companies to utilize those resources and to basically sell them to the highest bidder. And when you have a behavior like this of the leading spacefaring nation, everybody else is going to do the same. So the Chinese are going to basically disregard those principles, the Russians at some point, probably the Europeans as well. So at the end, we'll see what will be the attitude of India on this, but everybody is, all of these leading spacefaring nations right now, they are competing to be on the moon, for example, to be the first to have some sort of sit on a table when they are splitting those resources between themselves. So this is a huge problem. So the implementation, and basically right now, because of these opportunities, economic opportunities that we are seeing, the international space law principles that are, I think, just now are going to be, let's say, reinterpreted. They're going to be some sort of denouncing will be.
Thank you so much for answering my question. This is something that we've actually been meaning to ask you also, like the connection with private entities and resources, like you already mentioned. And yeah, Ritika, to you.
Yeah, so that brings us to the next question. So we spoke about the opportunities and the resources and private entities. So our next question is about that only. So there's been much more increase in private space activities, like, and also we have several conversations about the colonization of Mars and everything. So, what is the area of law? Like, is the law ready to deal with such objects and subjects yet? Like such an important topic like colonization of Mars. So, is the law ready to deal with it?
Okay, so again, I see two parts in your question. Let's clarify for the audience here that there is vivid and profitable space industry globally right now. We're talking about so many sectors, but even if you think about telecommunications sector or navigation sector, you understand that it is a huge industry. And just to give some sort of a perspective of where India is located right now and how India is positioned. So you have a space sector that is generating around $10 billion in dollars per annum per year. It is increasing well, so there is a growth in it. It's providing around 45 to 50,000 jobs, and it right now it stands something like 2.5% of the global space economy, so to speak. So India has its place, right? India, and what is remarkable about this is that India is achieving a lot with much small type of resources, much lower budget than, for example, the Americans and the Europeans and then the Chinese. So we have smart people, we have a lot of ingenuity here, and India has its strong place among the spacefaring nations. Now, with respect to Mars, things are a little bit different because there are a lot of unanswered questions about Mars. Okay, so first, this is a very difficult project, as you can imagine. Reaching Mars, staying there, you don't know what the environment is, or at least the public thinks that the government doesn't know what the environment is, all right? Because we don't know whether there is classified information, whether access to Mars already happened, okay? Because there are examples or there are indications that this might have done decades ago, okay? But I'm not sure that we can actually, we have to be very careful whether we believe those statements or not, all right? So let's assume that Mars is still unreachable and the technology that is used today, SpaceX is the leader and the company that is making everything in their best, everything there, a lot of resources there. They're pulling into this, as you know, and they're planning to utilize it, but how? Not according to international space law principles, but according to their own views and Elon Musk's views. And maybe discussed with US government, maybe not, I don't know. So it is going to become, how to say, very interesting in the next 10, 15 years when Mars is already reached, probably. What kind of legal issues and political issues will emerge? Because Elon Musk is going to live a couple of more decades, maybe, but these steps that are made are going to create precedents that could lead to war. Okay, so it is very important that states, especially China and Russia together against United States, are not engaged in a serious conflict on this. So this is my answer.
That is interesting to know, Professor, because we keep hearing about all these things, and I mean, not just like colonization of Mars, but even other things such as someone's trying to buy a piece of moon, trying to name a star, those kinds of things. And it's evident from these discussions that people are already trying to reach outside, trying to capitalize on all these resources and mine asteroids and all that. So I definitely also agree, and I think nations need to come together instead of fighting for, but yeah. So, one last question that I'd like to ask you is, when it comes to the private entities discussion, we cannot ignore the discussion of environmental degradation because as technology advances, there is, it's inversely proportional. So, how do you think international space law bridges the gap between environment degradation and technological development in the context of space law?
I think there are two aspects here, again, that I see. Now, the first one is whether states, when we talk about environment, we're talking for the first aspect is if we think about the outer space environment, okay? Because it is also part of the environment. So the outer space environment is hugely neglected by the states. Terrible experiments have been done in the past, including different tests. And thank God nuclear testing was forbidden because states understood early that this could be disastrous. But today we are seeing one of the major problems in the space industry is the generation of huge amount of space debris. This is not considered as pollution of outer space. This is considered as completely legitimate activity. And basically, everybody can leave their non-functional satellites in outer space. And if they are somehow destroyed by crashing with each other or by destruction from an asteroid or some other sort or dismantling, and they could create huge problem for the remaining functional satellites, all right? So this issue is of primary importance. It continues to be extremely, extremely troubling for the space industry, for the whole global space sector. And it is discussed for 30 years, and I don't see any progress in this. Why? I see a little bit of progress in the last 3-4 years, but not enough. Not enough. The biggest problem is that private companies, space that are involved in space industry, they do not see the merit to basically to clean the orbits and to take the orbital debris out, or to basically to remove their own non-functional satellites. Now we're seeing, as I've said in the last 3-4 years, a little bit of progress in this. There are companies in Europe, in Japan, in the United States that are emerging with these activities, but still, this is 10 times less than that is needed, at least. Now, the second aspect, Tanya, that we should point out is that space assets and space resources from space, particularly satellites, are indispensable when we talk about monitoring of in the environment of Earth, all right, climate change, weather patterns, everything that is related with the difficult times that we are facing right now with the climate catastrophe or climate change, whatever you want to call it. And this technology that you mentioned, it is very, very, it's helping a lot. It's very needed by all the scientists and decision makers to basically to orient themselves with respect to what is happening on Earth. Yeah, so this is very important, and space is hugely valuable in this respect. Okay.
All right, Professor, thank you for telling us that. We have been, as students, reading a lot about space debris, and it really fills us with concern because ultimately it is, like it is a part of the environment. So it is important that we make sure that it's not polluted. But this has been a very enriching discussion for us. We were able to highlight several key points from UFOs to environmental degradation. And I feel that people who are learning about space law for the first time would be very interested in knowing more because of this. And space law enthusiasts who will be watching will definitely be able to relate and would feel inspired from your words. So thank you so much for joining us and taking out the time.
Thank you, Tanya and Ritvika. Good luck with the whole blog, and looking forward to listening to other interviews, discussions, and to reading more articles.
All right, Professor. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor, for joining us.